Hey, it's Nathan. Welcome back to Story Lab. I want to start today with a question that sounds simple and isn't. If someone took the thing you love most, and you had one working hour before the trail went cold, what would actually save you? Money? Rage? A phone full of contacts? Here's the uncomfortable answer, and it's the reason this story stuck with me for a week. The people who are genuinely good at getting someone back almost never look like it. They're calm to the point of being boring. They notice small, stupid details. A repainted curb, a knot in a shoelace, the exact second a bell rings, and they file those details away for years before they ever need them. That's the man in this story. He spent a decade doing work his own country will never put in writing. Then he walked away from it after a night he refuses to describe, and he took the quietest job he could find, driving a family to school and back, waiting in parking garages, holding an umbrella. Everyone around him assumed the umbrella was the whole man. So this is a story about kidnapping, about a private bank, about a boy named Elliot, and about the difference between a man who is dangerous and a man who is prepared. Along the way, you're going to pick up some genuinely useful things: how professional crews actually pick a target, why the ransom is almost never the point, and why the smartest thing a victim's family can do is often the thing that feels most like giving up. Stay with me. The turn in the middle of this one is worth it. The car was a 12-year-old Mercedes wagon in a color the manufacturer had called anthracite and everyone else called gray, and Harlan Vance had chosen it himself over the objections of 3 people who thought a family like the Ellsworths ought to be driven in something with a hood ornament. He'd made his case in about 40 seconds. Nobody follows a gray wagon. Nobody photographs a gray wagon. A gray wagon in Philadelphia in February is a rumor. Malcolm Ellsworth had listened, nodded once, and signed the purchase order, and that was the first time Harlan understood that the man he worked for was smarter than the building he worked in. Harlan was 41. He had a flat nose that had been broken twice and set once, a notch missing from the top of his left ear, and a way of standing with his weight on the balls of his feet that people found either reassuring or unsettling, depending entirely on what kind of week they were having. He spoke rarely, and with an accent that had been sanded down by 20 years away from the town in Hampshire where he was born. His resume, the one in the Ellsworth household files, said 11 years, British Army, logistics and transport. It was not a lie so much as a sentence with most of the words removed. The truth was that for 9 of those years, Harlan had belonged to a thing that has a boring administrative name and no public existence. A small group inside the Special Air Service that gets loaned out to the people who need someone to already be in a country before anyone official arrives. They called it the Increment. Men in it did not have unit patches or reunion dinners. They had passports and other names and a talent for being unmemorable. He'd left after a night in a place he had never once described to another human being, not to a doctor, not to a priest, not to the woman in Lisbon he'd nearly married. What he would say, if pressed hard by someone he trusted, was this: he had done everything correctly, and correct had not been enough. And afterward, he'd realized he no longer wanted to be the kind of man who was sent. He wanted to be the kind of man who was already there. So he drove. The Ellsworths were the 4th generation of a private merchant bank that sat in a narrow limestone building on Walnut Street and did not advertise. Ellsworth Trust and Merchant did not have branches. It had clients, 400 in some of them, mostly families, mostly old, and the bank's actual product was not lending. It was patience. Malcolm Ellsworth's grandfather had a line the family still repeated at Christmas: "We are not in the money business. We are in the 100-year business." Malcolm was 53, tall, going soft in the middle. With reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, he cut himself, because he'd been doing it since Yale, and couldn't see the point of stopping. He was the vice chairman's oldest friend, and the board's most stubborn vote. He had a habit of saying no slowly, which drove people insane, because a fast no you can argue with, and a slow no just sits there. His wife Helena ran the Ellsworth Foundation and was better at rooms than he was. She could walk into a benefit and know within 90 seconds who was leaving their spouse, who was in trouble, and who was pretending to be in trouble to seem interesting. She was the one who had hired Harlan, actually, over Malcolm's mild objection that a driver from an agency would be fine. Helena had read his file, looked at the file for 11 seconds, then looked at Harlan for a long time, and said, "You've done something you're not putting on paper." Harlan had said, "Yes, ma'am." "Will it walk in my front door one day?" "No, ma'am." "Then I don't need to know it." She'd signed the contract herself. They had 2 children. Delaney was 16, angular and furious about approximately everything, currently in a phase where she would not be driven anywhere by anyone, and took the train instead, which cost Harlan more worry than the rest of his job combined. And there was Elliot. Elliot Ellsworth was 9, small for it, with his mother's straight dark hair and his father's habit of thinking for 4 seconds before answering a question. He was the kind of child who read the plaques at museums. He asked Harlan about the ear the first week. Most adults never asked, they just looked at it and then looked away. And Harlan had told him a dog did it, which was true. And Elliot had asked what the dog's name was, and Harlan had said he'd never been introduced, and Elliot had laughed so hard he got the hiccups. After that, they were friends in the specific way a 9-year-old and a 41-year-old can be friends, which is to say, Elliot talked and Harlan listened, and occasionally taught him something with his hands. Philadelphia traffic on the Vine Street Expressway is 35 wasted minutes a day, so Harlan filled them. He taught the boy knots, a bowline first, because a bowline is the one that saves your life, then a clove hitch, a taut line, a figure 8. Elliot got obsessive about it the way small boys do, and by October he was doing them behind his back with his eyes shut, and by November he'd started tying his own shoelaces in a double sheet bend, which is not what a sheet bend is for, and which drove his mother crazy, because it took him a full minute to get his shoes off. "It's a stupid knot for shoes," Harlan told him. "It's the strongest one," Elliot said. "It's the strongest one for joining 2 ropes of different thickness. Your laces are the same thickness." Elliot considered this with great seriousness. But what if one day they're not? Harlan had no answer to that, so he let it go, and the boy kept tying his shoes wrong for 8 months, and Harlan never once imagined that this would be the detail that saved his life. There was a second man in the Ellsworth household who thought about security, and he did not like Harlan Vance. Lucian Rourke had come recommended by the bank's insurers, which is a sentence that should be read the way it was meant, as a warning. He was 50, kept himself in the kind of shape that photographs well, wore a lapel pin from a police department he had left under circumstances the insurers had described as administrative, and he ran what he called the Household Protective Program. In practice, this meant 3 contract men on rotating shifts, a camera system Rourke was very proud of, and a laminated binder. Rourke loved the binder. It had tabs, it had a section on posture and a section on optics, and it had a route sheet for the school run that specified the same 2 roads every day, with a note that predictability builds community, familiarity, which is the sort of sentence you write when you have decided in advance what you want to do and are now inventing a reason. Harlan drove a different route every day. He never announced it. He just did it, 40-something variations, some of them absurd, one of them going out through the cemetery gate and around by the reservoir, and every few weeks Rourke would call him into the little office off the garage and tap the binder and say the word compliance, and Harlan would say yes, and then continue exactly as before. What Rourke could not stand was that Helena knew. Helena had asked Harlan in the 2nd month why the drive time varied, and Harlan had said, "Because I'd rather you didn't know where we'll be at 8:15 either, ma'am," and Helena had said, "Good," and never brought it up again. That was the whole war, and Rourke lost it in a single exchange he hadn't even been present for. So the resentment sat there, low and constant, the way resentment does in a house with money in it. At the bank, Malcolm Ellsworth was fighting a war of his own, and he was losing it politely. 2 years earlier, a consortium had come sniffing around Ellsworth Trust and Merchant. They wanted to buy it, fold it into a platform, and sell heritage private banking to people in 3 countries who wanted to feel old. The offer was extraordinary. The board split. 6 for, 5 against, and the whole thing hung on the vote controlled by the Ellsworth Family Trust, a block of shares that Malcolm's grandfather had tied up in a structure so intricate that the lawyer who wrote it had put a diagram of it on his office wall like a piece of art. The trust's voting shares were held for the benefit of Malcolm's children. Malcolm was sole trustee. Malcolm voted no. He voted no in January, and again in June, and again the following January, and each time he did it slowly, and each time the vice chairman of the bank sat 2 seats down and smiled and said, "Understood, Mal," and made a note in a leather notebook. Charlton Hollister had been Malcolm's roommate at 19. He had stood up at Malcolm's wedding. He was Elliot's godfather and had given the boy a set of engraved cufflinks at his christening that Helena thought was a hilarious thing to give an infant, and Malcolm thought was perfect. Hollister was the charming one, the one who could raise money at a dinner table, the one who'd carried the bank through 2 hard decades of relationships. Malcolm was too awkward to maintain. He was also, by the spring of that year, 61 years old, 3 years from a mandatory retirement he had no intention of accepting, and personally guaranteed against a set of commitments that only made sense if the consortium deal closed and he became chairman of the new entity. He had done the math many times. There was exactly one obstacle in the world, and it had been his best friend for 42 years. The trust document had a clause. Everything that happened later lived inside that clause, so it's worth understanding. Article 11 allowed the sole trustee, in circumstances of exigency affecting the welfare of a beneficiary, to appoint a co-trustee by signed instrument, without court approval, effective immediately. It was written in 1961 by a man who imagined a plane crash or a stroke, a way for the family to keep functioning if the trustee was suddenly unable. It required 1 signature and 1 witness. A co-trustee could vote the shares. Hollister found the clause in March. He read it 11 times. He thought about it for 6 weeks, and in that 6 weeks he did not do anything except take a very long walk on a Sunday and come back and pour himself a drink and understand, completely and calmly, that he had already decided. He did not want to hurt anyone. He would have said that sincerely, and it would have been true, and it would not have mattered at all. He wanted an hour of a father's panic, a signature, and a boy home by dinner. In his head it was clean. In his head, nobody even had to know. The man he hired had no such illusions. Von Teague was 48 and had spent his 20s repossessing cars in Delaware County, and his 30s skip tracing for bail bondsmen, which is to say, he had a genuine, professional-grade talent for finding people who did not want to be found, and had eventually noticed that the same skill set worked in reverse. He now described himself, when he described himself at all, as being in acquisitions. He had a crew of 3 he'd used for 6 years, a wheelman called Corso, a big silent one called Pharaoh, and a nervy little technician named Wiley, who ran the phones and the cameras, and had never once been in the same room as a victim. Teague had rules. Rule 1, no bodies, because a body turns a business into a manhunt. Rule 2, the client never meets the crew. Rule 3, take the target from a place where being taken looks like being collected. And Teague had a 4th rule he'd never said out loud, because it was the one that made him money, and it was this: get inside the house first. Never take a target you don't already own the schedule of. Which is why, in April, a man from the Household Protective Program of the Ellsworth family drove out to a diner in Ben Salim and sat down across from someone he'd been told to call an insurance investigator, and left 90 minutes later with an envelope and a reason to feel good about himself. The 7th of May was warm and stupidly beautiful, and it started to go wrong at 6:40 in the morning, though nobody would know that for 11 hours. At 6:40, Harlan came down to the garage and found the wagon on a lift. Not his lift, not his shop. A mobile service van was parked in the courtyard with its ramps down, and a man in coveralls was crouched under the front end of the Mercedes with a light, and Lucian Rourke was standing there with a coffee and a clipboard, and he said, without turning around, "Recall notice." Steering rack. Insurers flagged it. Harlan looked at the van. He looked at the man's boots, which were clean, and at the van's tires, which were not. "I'll take the Suburban," he said. "Suburban's got the foundation event at 9, Rourke said. "Mrs. Ellsworth needs it staged. I've got Dobbs on the school run this morning. It's covered." Dobbs was one of the contract men, 26, decent enough, absolutely nothing behind the eyes. Harlan stood very still for a moment. It is worth saying exactly what he felt, because he would take it apart 100 times later. He felt a small, dry click somewhere behind his sternum. Not alarm, just the sensation of 2 things that shouldn't touch. Touching. A recall he hadn't heard about. A van that had driven a long way to get here. A route he wasn't driving. "When was the notice issued?" he asked. "March," Rourke said, and turned a page. Harlan went upstairs. He made Elliot's lunch himself, which he did not normally do, and he stood in the mudroom while the boy sat on the bench fighting with his shoes. "You're doing the sheet bend again. It's the strongest one," Elliot said, without looking up. Harlan crouched. He was not a demonstrative man, and he had never once hugged the boy, and what he did instead was flick the finished knot with a fingernail, the way you test a fitting. "That's a good one," he said. "That's a really good one, actually. Don't let anyone untie it for you." Elliot beamed at him for the entire 9 seconds it took to put on his backpack, and then he was out the door with Dobbs, and Harlan stood in the mudroom with a lunch bag he'd forgotten to hand over, and that would be the picture he could not get out of his head for the next 14 hours. The Chestnut Hill Preparatory School has a stone gate on the east side and a drop-off lane that curls behind the athletic building, and by 3:15 every weekday, it is a chaos of 200 idling cars, parents on phones, a crossing guard, and a portable orange sign that says, "Stop for Children." At 3:09, a tow truck with municipal markings pulled into the lane's mouth, and its driver put out cones and told the first 6 cars that the lane was closed for a water main inspection. "Redirect to the north gate. Sorry, folks, 5 minutes." At 3:11, the orange "Stop for Children" sign had been moved 40 feet and now stood where it directed the walking children around the athletic building's blind corner, out of the sightline of the crossing guard and of camera number 4. At 3:14, a black Yukon with a magnetic decal reading Chestnut Hill Prep Activities sat idling at that blind corner with its rear door open. At 3:16, a man in a school polo shirt with a laminated badge on a lanyard said, "Elliot Ellsworth? Your dad's got you today, buddy. We're going out the north gate." And Elliot Ellsworth, who was 9 and who had been raised in a house where adults with lanyards were the whole architecture of the world, said, "Okay," and got in the car. At 3:17, the Yukon was on Germantown Avenue. At 3:22, the tow truck pulled its cones and left. At 3:31, Dobbs, sitting in the Suburban at the drop-off lane where he had been told to wait, texted the house. "Kid hasn't come out." The next 4 hours were a specific kind of hell that people who have not been through it imagine as loud, and which is actually mostly administrative. The school assumed a mix-up. They checked the aftercare list twice. The first police unit arrived at 4:05 and took a report as a possible custody issue, because that is what most of them are. A detective named Trina Callahan got it at 4:50, and she was good, and by 5:30 she had the school on lockdown and was pulling camera footage, and by 6 she had found that camera 4 covered the blind corner and had been showing a still frame for 11 minutes on account of what the vendor would later describe as a network fault. By 6:40, an FBI agent named Devlin Frayne was in the Ellsworth kitchen setting up a recorder on the landline, saying the sentence they all say, which is that the first hours are the important ones, in the tone of a man who knows they're already gone. Helena Ellsworth sat at the end of her own kitchen table, with both hands flat on the wood, which is what she did instead of screaming. Delaney had come home from school into the middle of it and was sitting on the stairs with her phone dead in her hand, and Malcolm was standing at the window doing nothing at all, and every time somebody's radio crackled he flinched like it had touched him. Lucian Rourke was extremely busy. He had a tablet out. He was talking about the perimeter. He said the word protocol 4 times in an hour, and Harlan Vance was standing against the wall by the pantry door, where he had been standing since 5 o'clock, not moving, not speaking, looking at nothing. He was not paralyzed. He was working. He had been building the picture since 4:10, and the picture already had a shape he did not like, because everything about it was correct. The tow truck was correct. The magnetic decal was correct. The polo shirt was correct. Somebody had used the boy's name and the boy's father in one sentence, which meant they knew a 9-year-old's threat model better than the school did. And a recall notice for a steering rack had arrived at 6:40 in the morning, on a van whose tires had come a long way, to take the one car in Philadelphia that never drove the same road twice out of service for a day. At 7:51, the landline rang. Agent Frayne held up a hand, counted 3 rings, and nodded. Malcolm picked up. "Mr. Ellsworth." The voice was male, unhurried, filtered through something that flattened it. "Don't talk. Listen. Your son's fine. He's had a sandwich. He's watching cartoons in a room with the heat on." Malcolm made a sound. "That was the good part," the voice said. Here's the rest. $4 million. Wired where I tell you, before 9 tomorrow morning, or you get him back in pieces." And then the man laughed. That was the thing that stayed with everyone in the room afterward. The thing Callahan wrote down verbatim in her notes, and Frayne played back 16 times. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was worse than that. It was the easy, genuine laugh of a man who has just made a joke at work, who is comfortable, who is not remotely frightened, and who is going to go home after this. Helena's chair went over backward. She got to the sink and gripped it, and could not get air in. 3 attempts, 4, her shoulders climbing, and Delaney was suddenly there with both hands on her mother's back, saying, "Mom, Mom," in a voice too young for the room. "Proof of life," Frayne said, low and fast. "Ask. Now. I need." Malcolm's voice broke and reassembled. "I need to know he's alive." "Course you do." The voice sounded almost approving. "Check your email in 10 minutes. And Mr. Ellsworth, no more police than you already have. I can count the cars on your street." Click. 9 minutes later, a photograph arrived from an address that would turn out to belong to a hotel business center in Wilmington. It was Elliot, on a cot, in a bare room with a green-painted cinder block wall, holding that day's Inquirer up in front of his chest. He was not crying. He looked, if anything, deeply annoyed, which broke Helena in half all over again, because that was his face when he was being told to wait for something. The room went to work on it. Frayne's people had the file within 4 minutes. Callahan started on the newspaper edition, the light angle, the shadow length. Somebody said the wall paint looked institutional. Somebody else said the cot was military surplus. Rourke said, loudly, that he'd have the image run through enhancement. Harlan crossed the kitchen for the first time in 3 hours, leaned over the laptop, and looked at the boy's feet. Elliot was wearing his own shoes, and the laces on the left shoe were tied in a double sheet bend, and the laces on the right shoe were tied in a bowline, which is not a knot that can happen by accident, and which is not a knot you can tie in a shoelace without deciding to. Harlan straightened up. "Sir," he said, and it took a second for Malcolm to register that the driver was speaking, because in 8 months in that house, Harlan Vance had initiated a conversation with him perhaps 4 times. "Sir, may I see you and Mrs. Ellsworth for 90 seconds? "This isn't the moment," Rourke said. "It's exactly the moment," Harlan said, and did not look at him. They went into the study. Malcolm shut the door. Helena stood with her arms wrapped around herself, and her jaw set, and she looked at Harlan the way she had looked at him the day she hired him, which is to say, she looked at the part that wasn't on paper. "Say it," she said. "Your son is talking to me," Harlan said. Malcolm blinked. "What?" "He's tied his laces in 2 different knots, a sheet bend on the left, a bowline on the right. I taught him both. He knows I'd notice." Harlan turned the laptop around, and for 1 second something moved across his face that neither of them had ever seen there. That means he's thinking. It means he isn't hurt badly enough to stop thinking. And it means he has hands free at least some of the time. Helena put a hand over her mouth. "There's more," Harlan said. "The bowline. I taught him a bowline is the rescue knot, the one you tie around yourself. He's telling me it's him, and he's telling me he remembers, and I'd bet the rest of my life he's counting something." "Counting," Malcolm said. "He's a boy who reads museum plaques. In a locked room with nothing to do, he'll count. Traffic, trains, bells, something." Harlan closed the laptop. "Sir, I need you to do one thing tonight, and it's going to feel like the worst thing you've ever done. Anything. Stop the wire." Malcolm stared at him. "They said 9 in the morning. They said pieces. Harlan, they said." "I heard him. $4 million is nothing to me. It's a line in a ledger. If I can buy my son with it." "You can't," Harlan said. "That's what I'm telling you. Sir, listen to me carefully. That call was wrong." "Wrong how?" "He didn't ask for cash. He asked for a wire, which is traceable, slow, and the single stupidest way on earth to take $4 million from a bank family. He gave you 13 hours, which is not enough time to assemble anything difficult, and is exactly enough time to keep you from sleeping." And he laughed. Harlan's voice stayed absolutely level. "Men who are frightened of getting caught do not laugh. Men who are not frightened are either fools or they're not actually taking a risk. That crew was too good at the school gate to be fools." But Helena said, very quietly, "Then what do they want? Something they can't take. Something you have to hand them." Harlan looked at Malcolm. "Sir, Between now and 9 tomorrow morning, is there anything in the world you could be made to sign? The silence lasted a long time. Then Malcolm Ellsworth sat down on the arm of his own sofa like his legs had been removed and said, Article 11. He explained it in 90 seconds. The trust, the vote, the consortium. The clause his grandfather's lawyer had written for a plane crash that let a sole trustee, in an emergency, hand half his power to another man with one signature and one witness. When he was finished, Harlan said, Who knows that clause exists? 4 lawyers. Me. Malcolm's mouth had gone the color of paper. And Charlton. Harlan nodded slowly, like a man confirming a weather forecast he'd already dressed for. Sir, he said, stop the wire. Young Master Elliot will sleep in his own room tonight. At 9:20 that night, Harlan Vance walked the drop-off lane at Chestnut Hill Prep with a hardware store flashlight, and he did it the way he had walked ground for a living, which is slowly and in a grid. Agent Frayn's forensic people had already been and gone. Callahan had left. What Harlan was looking for was not evidence, it was intention. He found the first thing in 4 minutes. A scuff of fresh orange traffic paint on the asphalt 40 feet from where the Stop for Children sign belonged. And, at the sign's proper position, 4 small holes in the grass where its feet had stood for years. Somebody had moved a sign that weighed 60 pounds and then, out of pure professional tidiness, marked the new spot in advance so it could be placed fast. That paint was dry. Dry paint in May takes at least a day. Harlan stood there and let the implication land. They had rehearsed. Somebody had been at this gate, at this hour, on a previous day, timing it. He found the second thing at the mouth of the lane, where the tow truck had staged, a rectangle of pavement noticeably cleaner than everything around it, about the size of a shoebox, where a magnetic sign had sat on the truck's flank and lifted the dirt off when it was peeled away. The third thing he found by looking up. There is a bank building diagonally opposite the east gate, and above its door is a small hemispherical camera aimed at its own sidewalk. And in that camera's fisheye, the mouth of the drop-off lane sits in the top left corner of frame. Worthless for identification. Perfect for timing. At 11:10, Harlan was in the back room of that bank branch with the district manager, who had been woken up, and who kept saying that he really ought to call somebody, and who kept scrubbing the footage anyway because a very calm man was standing beside him. The tow truck arrived at 3:07:40. It left at 3:22:10. Between those times it was stationary, and its driver never left the cab. But on the previous Thursday, at 3:06:55, the same truck had driven past the gate, slowed to about 5 miles an hour, and driven on. And on the Thursday before that, Harlan wrote down the plate, which the fisheye rendered as a smear, and the shape of a dent in the left rear quarter panel, which it rendered perfectly. He got back to the house at midnight and did not go inside. He sat in the courtyard on the wall by the garage and made 2 phone calls. The first was to a man in Providence named Ewan Doyle, who had spent 6 years in the same unhelpfully named organization as Harlan and now owned a marine rigging and salvage business, and who answered on the second ring because Harlan Vance had never once in 19 years called him after 10 p.m. for a social reason. Say it, Doyle said. A boy, Harlan said. 9. Taken this afternoon. I need you here by 6, and I need the small boat, and I need you to not ask me the second question. What's the second question? Whether we're calling anyone. There was a pause of maybe 2 seconds. 6, Doyle said, and hung up. The second call was to a woman who ran a towing and impound yard in Bristol, who had once had a very bad problem with a client of the Ellsworths, a problem that Harlan had made go away on a Sunday afternoon without anyone's knowledge, including his employer's. He described a dent. She said she'd ask around, and that it would take until morning, and that she owed him more than a phone call. Then he went inside, and he did the thing he had been putting off, which was to look properly at Lucian Rourke. Rourke was in the kitchen at 1 a.m, wide awake, mainlining coffee, narrating. He was on his 4th version of a theory involving a disgruntled former groundskeeper. He'd printed things. Harlan watched him for 4 full minutes from the hall, and what he saw was not guilt exactly. Rourke did not look like a man who had helped steal a child. He looked like a man who was working extremely hard at not looking at one particular corner of his own mind. That was worse, in a way. A conspirator can be broken. A man who has decided he didn't do anything will hold that line into the ground. At 2 in the morning, Harlan sat down beside him and said, quietly, "The recall notice. Do you have the paperwork?" "Somewhere." "Why?" "Because I called Mercedes at 11, Harlan lied, "and there's no open recall on that chassis. So somebody put a van in our courtyard this morning under a false pretext, and I'd like to know who booked it." Rourke's face did a thing. It was very small, a 2-frame flicker, the expression of a man discovering that a decision he'd filed away as harmless is currently walking toward him with a knife. "The insurers sent it," he said. "Which insurer? Which name? I'd have to check. Check now." Rourke stood up. "I don't take instructions from the driver," he said, and left the room. And that was the moment Harlan stopped needing to prove anything. He didn't confront him. He didn't tell Frayne. Both of those would have produced a lawyer and a wall of silence and 48 hours of process, and Elliot Ellsworth did not have 48 hours. Instead, at 2:15 in the morning, Harlan Vance walked into the room where the FBI had its equipment, made himself extremely visible, and said to Agent Frayne, in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as the hallway, where Lucien Rourke was standing pretending to read a printout, "Sir, I'd like the family to know that Mr. Ellsworth has authorized the wire. It goes at 8. They want it done quietly, from the bank's own account, and Mrs. Ellsworth would like the money moved to the Walnut Street vault tonight, so there's no delay." Frayne, who was a very experienced man, looked at him for a beat and a half and then said, "Understood." Harlan went out to the courtyard. 14 minutes later, a phone that Lucien Rourke kept in his jacket rather than in the security office made a call to a number in Ben Salem that lasted 40 seconds. Harlan couldn't hear the call. He didn't need to. He was standing at the far end of the courtyard in the dark, watching a man he despised deliver, free of charge, the one piece of information Harlan actually needed. That there was somebody to deliver it to, and that they wanted to be told. Ewan Doyle came down Route 95 in a truck towing a 9-foot inflatable, and arrived at 10 to 6, with 2 coffees and a duffel bag he did not open in the house. He was a compact, cheerful, prematurely white-haired man who looked like a golf instructor and was not. He shook Malcolm Ellsworth's hand, said "Sir," and then said nothing else to the family for the rest of the day, which Helena would later describe as the most reassuring thing anyone did in 48 hours. At 6:15, the woman from the impound yard in Bristol called back. The dent belonged to a 2009 rollback registered to Keystone Recovery Services, a company that had gone out of business in 2016 and whose fleet had been bought at auction by a man named Vaughn Teague, who now leased the trucks out and had never bothered to change the door decals because a tow truck that looks municipal can park anywhere in the city of Philadelphia for 11 days before anyone asks a question. Harlan wrote the name on the back of an envelope. At 6:40, the second proof of life arrived. 14 seconds of video, sent from a different burner, of Elliot sitting on the cot with a bottle of water. Somebody off camera said, "Say your name and today's date." Elliot said it. Then he said, "I'm okay, Dad." And then he said one more thing that made no sense to anybody in the kitchen. "Tell Harlan it's a long one." Rourke said, "That's coaching. They've told him what to say." Helena said, "That's not coaching. He's never called anyone by their first name in his life except..." And she stopped and turned and looked at Harlan and said, "What's a long one?" Harlan had already put his headphones on. He listened to the 14 seconds 22 times, under the boy's voice, under the room tone, at about the 4-second mark and again at 11, there was a low, doubled clanking that a city ear discards automatically, the sound of a bridge. Not traffic on a bridge. A bridge moving. A railroad lift span dropping into its seat makes a sound like a filing cabinet the size of a church closing, followed by the clatter of the counterweight chains, and it is one of the least mistakable sounds in the world if you have ever spent a night lying still next to one. And behind that, faint, at the very end of the clip, 5 notes on a bell. Not a strike, a carillon, a little 4-bar Westminster fragment, the kind that plays on the hour from a church tower. Harlan pulled the headphone jack out and turned the volume up so the room could hear it, and said to Frayne, "How many working lift bridges are inside city limits?" Frayne blinked. 3 or 4. "How many have a church with a carillon within about half a mile?" "The FBI has extremely good people for this, and it took them 11 minutes. There is one." The old Conrail lift bridge over the mouth of Frankford Creek, at the eastern edge of Port Richmond, 400 yards from St. Adalbert's, whose tower plays the quarter hours and has done since 1948. A long one, Harlan said. He's counting. Bells on the quarter hour and long ones on the hour. He was telling us what time he heard it, and he was telling us there's a bell. He was already standing. That boy is 9 years old, and he's giving us a grid reference. By 7:15, they had satellite and street imagery of 11 acres of dead industrial riverfront, a bankrupt marine terminal, 2 collapsed warehouses, a fuel depot, and a long, low building with a green tile roof that the city's records described as a former municipal cold storage and ice plant, decommissioned in 1994, currently owned by a holding company with a Delaware address. Cold storage. Interior walls of cinder block, painted institutional green, because that is what they painted everything with in 1961. And now the argument started, and it was the most important argument of the whole story. Frayne wanted a warrant, a SWAT element, drone overwatch, and a 6-hour build. He said the word responsibly twice. He was not being a coward, he was being correct, by every rule that had ever been written down, and he had 11 years of doing it, and a wall of cases where it had worked. Harlan let him finish. Then he said, "Sir, with respect, at 8 o'clock they expect a wire. At 9, when it doesn't come, they'll call and threaten. At some point today, the man who ordered this is going to walk into this house or into that bank with a piece of paper and ask my employer to sign it, and he is going to time that request to the exact minute of maximum terror, and if a tactical element goes through that ice plant at 2 in the afternoon with helicopters, the man who ordered it hears about it in 90 seconds, and the boy becomes a liability. You don't know there's a man who ordered it. I do. Then give me a name and I'll—" "If I give you a name," Harlan said, "you'll do it properly. You'll open a file, you'll notify, and somewhere in that process, a phone call gets made, and a 9-year-old ends up in the river. I'm not insulting you. Your system is honest. That's the problem." Frayne stared at him. "And what exactly do you propose? That your people take the ground the correct way and take 4 hours doing it," Harlan said. "And that a boat goes up Frankford Creek at 11 this morning with 2 men in it delivering a used outboard motor to a scrap dealer, which is the most boring thing that happens on that river all week." There was a very long silence. Frayne said, "I can't authorize that." "No, sir," Harlan agreed. "You can't." Malcolm Ellsworth, who had not spoken in 20 minutes, said, "Do it." And then he said the sentence that mattered, because he said it in front of a federal agent, in his own kitchen, out loud. "Charlton Hollister is coming here at noon. He called me at 5 this morning to say he was coming to sit with us. Nobody outside this house knows about Article 11 except him." Frayne turned around slowly. "Say that again," he said, "and let me get a recorder. Frankford Creek at 11 in the morning smells like diesel and low tide, and the water is the color of weak tea, and nobody looks at a rubber boat. Doyle ran the outboard at idle." Harlan sat on the forward tube in a paint-spattered hooded sweatshirt with a rusted 20-horse motor between his knees, and to anyone watching from the bank, they were 2 guys doing exactly what 2 guys in a rubber boat do on that creek, which is haul junk somewhere for cash. They passed the ice plant at 11:04 and did not slow down. Harlan counted. 2 vehicles behind the loading dock, the black Yukon with its decal peeled, and a gray pickup. 1 man on the dock smoking, facing the water, bored, phone in his hand, no earpiece, no long gun, no visible discipline. 3 roll-up doors, 2 rusted shut, a steel personnel door at the northeast corner, propped with a brick, on a 55-degree morning, meant the building had no working ventilation, and they'd been in there overnight, and it meant that nobody in that crew was worried about anything at all. That was the whole assessment, and it took 11 seconds, and it told Harlan that these were competent criminals rather than dangerous men, which is a distinction that saves or costs lives. They beached the boat 200 yards upstream in the reeds behind the collapsed warehouse at 11:09. Meanwhile, in a kitchen in Chestnut Hill, at 11:58, Charlton Hollister arrived with a cardboard tray of coffees. He hugged Helena. He said the right things. He was genuinely, visibly upset, and this is important. He was not acting. He loved this family. He had been at the hospital the night Elliot was born. He sat down at that kitchen table with grief on his face like weather, and he held Malcolm's forearm, and he said, "Mal, I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it as your friend." And then, gently, he explained that if, God forbid, this went badly, or long, or if Malcolm were incapacitated by it, the bank could not be leaderless, that there was a mechanism in the trust for exactly this, that it was reversible, that it was nothing, that it was paperwork, and that he had taken the liberty of having Deirdre draw it up so Malcolm wouldn't have to think about it. He put a folder on the table. He said, "I'll witness it myself." And Malcolm Ellsworth, whose son had been gone for 20 hours, who had not slept, who had a federal recorder inside a fruit bowl 11 inches from that folder, said, "Charlie, yeah, Mal, how did you know I'd be asked for money by 9 this morning?" The kitchen got very quiet. "You said that on the phone," Hollister said. "I didn't. At 11:40, at the ice plant, Harlan had done something that had nothing to do with force. He had walked, unhurried, in a paint-spattered sweatshirt, straight up to the man smoking on the dock, holding a clipboard he'd taken from Doyle's truck, and said, "You Teagues guy?" "I'm the scrap pickup," he said 11. Pharaoh, the big silent one, said, "Nobody told me about a pickup." "Yeah," Harlan said wearily, "nobody tells me either," and turned to go, and then turned back the way people do when they've remembered something irritating, and said, "Hey, weird question. Your boss ever mention a guy called Hollister?" Pharaoh's face did nothing, but his thumb moved on the phone. "'Cause I did a job for Teague in March," Harlan said, "and the guy paying was a bank guy, and there's a thing going around that he's already sat down with the bureau, proffer, whatever they call it." He shrugged. "Not my business. Just, if it's the same guy, you might want to be the one who calls first, is all." And then he walked away, down the dock, at a completely normal speed, with his back to a man who had 30 pounds and 11 years on him, and got into a boat. It took 9 minutes. At 11:50, Corso the wheelman came out of the personnel door arguing on a phone. At 11:52, Wiley the technician came out with a laptop bag and stood in the sun looking like a man deciding something. At 11:55, Pharaoh walked to the Yukon, opened the driver's door, and sat in it with the door open, and did not start the engine, which is what a man does when he is waiting to be told whether to run. At 11:57, all three of them were on the far side of the building, out of the sightline of the northeast door, having the single most important conversation of their professional lives. Harlan Vance walked in through a door propped open with a brick. The interior was one long corridor of green cinder block, with a wet concrete floor and a smell like a swimming pool. 6 doors. He didn't call out. He went past 4 of them and stopped at the 5th because there was a folding chair outside it, and a paperback on the chair, and a bolt through the hasp. He drew the bolt. Elliot Ellsworth was sitting on a cot with his back against the wall and his knees up and his shoes off, and he had been picking apart the seam of the mattress for something to do, and when the door opened, he did not scream and he did not cry. He said, "It's a long one." "It is," Harlan said. "You did that exactly right." And then the boy came off the cot into him with a force that nearly put them both on the floor, and Harlan Vance, who had not embraced another human being since a hospital corridor in 2016, stood in a decommissioned municipal ice plant with a 9-year-old's arms locked around his ribs, and for 4 seconds did absolutely nothing except let it happen. Then he said, "Shoes, fast, sheet bends fine." They went out the northeast door at 12:01. Doyle had the boat off the reeds and running. They were 200 yards downstream before anyone on the far side of the building finished the argument. Nobody fired a shot. Nobody threw a punch. The most dangerous thing Harlan Vance did that morning was tell 3 men a plausible lie about their employer and then walk slowly away from it. There is a version of this story where it ends there, and it would be a fine story, and it would also be a failure. Because the crew was 3 men and a rented building. The man who had made the phone calls was Von Teague, and Teague would be found eventually, and would serve time, and would not particularly mind, because Teague had gone into a business with a known tariff. The man who had ordered it was going to be at that kitchen table drinking coffee out of a paper cup, and the man who had ordered it had 42 years of friendship, a foundation board seat, and the best lawyers in 3 states. Harlan Vance had thought about that at 4 o'clock in the morning, in the courtyard, before he ever got in a boat. Here is what he had built. At 6:30 that morning, before Doyle arrived, Harlan had sat down with Malcolm and said, "Send the wire." Malcolm had stared at him. "You told me to stop it. I told you to stop paying a ransom. This isn't a ransom. This is bait, and it's going to be the most obedient $4 million in the history of banking." And then he had explained it, and Agent Frayne, who had spent the previous hour on the phone with a supervisor and a federal magistrate, because he was, in fact, a very good agent, had said, "That's actually admissible." So at 7:58, from Ellsworth Trust and Merchant, $4 million had gone out to the account the kidnappers had specified in Curacao. It arrived, it was real, it cleared, and it carried, in the payment reference field, a 17-character alphanumeric string that Malcolm's compliance department had generated at 7:51 and logged with the FBI, and it moved under a court-authorized trap and trace that lit up every subsequent hop like a flare in a dark field. But the beautiful part wasn't the money. The beautiful part was the wire's originating instruction, which under the bank's own rules required a second authorizing signature above $2 million, and Malcolm, following instructions, had called the one man who could sign it at 6:50 in the morning and asked him. And Charlton Hollister had said yes, of course, anything, and had entered his credentials at 7:54 a.m. from his home terminal, personally authorizing a $4 million payment to an offshore account he would later swear under oath he had never heard of and had no knowledge of. At noon, in the kitchen in Chestnut Hill, Charlton Hollister was sitting with a folder in front of him explaining that Article 11 was just paperwork, when Malcolm's phone buzzed on the table, face up, and the message on the screen said, "He's in the boat." Hollister read it upside down. Everyone in the room watched him read it. Later, people would talk about the sound Helena made. It was not a scream. It was a single enormous inhale, the first full breath she had taken in 21 hours, and it seemed to go on for a very long time. Charlton Hollister said, "I'm sorry, is he?" And Malcolm Ellsworth stood up, put one hand flat on the folder, slid it back across the table to his oldest friend, and said, "Charlie, I'm not signing it, Mal. You authorized the wire. You asked me to." At 7:54 this morning, to an account in Curacao, Malcolm's voice was very quiet and very level, and it was the sound of a slow no, finally, at full volume. The account they gave us at 7:51. 3 minutes. Agent Devlin Frayne came in from the pantry with 2 other agents and read Charlton Hollister his rights in the kitchen where he had eaten Thanksgiving dinner for 19 years. Lucian Rourke, that day, had a different afternoon. At around 1 o'clock, with the boy in a hospital being checked over, with Hollister in a federal car, Rourke came out to the garage to get his jacket, and Harlan Vance was leaning against the workbench. "They got him," Rourke said. "Thank God, they did." "I'll want a full debrief on the van," Harlan said. "Was booked by a company called Keystone Recovery Services. You called them at 02:15 this morning from a phone you keep in your jacket. 40 seconds. You told them the money was moving to Walnut Street." He straightened up. "You didn't know they were going to take him, Lucian. I believe that. I think you sold a schedule and a route sheet for money, and I think you told yourself it was corporate intelligence, and I think when it happened yesterday, you decided very hard that it wasn't your fault." Rourke's face had gone the color of the concrete floor. "You can't prove. I don't have to. The Bureau has your phone records by now, and they have Wiley's laptop, because Wiley ran to a state trooper on Delaware Avenue at 12:40 this afternoon, in a panic, trying to be the first one through the door." Harlan tilted his head. "You want to know the funny part? He ran because he thought your friend Hollister had already flipped. He thought that because a man in a paint-covered sweatshirt told him so on a loading dock. He picked up his keys. There's a folding chair outside room 5 at the old ice plant, he said. The Bureau's finished with it. You should ask to see it. There's a paperback on it. Somebody sat in that chair for 19 hours listening to a 9-year-old count the bells at St. Adalbert's and read 40 pages and did not open the door once. He walked to the door of the garage. That's what you sold, Lucian, not a route sheet. Federal prosecutors are unsentimental people, and they are extremely fond of a case where the defendant personally moved the money. Charlton Hollister's lawyers ran a very expensive argument for 11 months about coercion, mistake, and the absence of any prior communication with Von Teague. an argument that survived right up until the government put Corso on the stand, having offered him the only good deal any of them got, and Corso explained, at length, the meetings in March at a diner in Ben Salim, and the envelope, and the man who paid in cash and always sat facing the door. Teague took 22 years. Farrow took 18. Wiley, who ran to the trooper, took 6. Lucian Rourke pleaded to conspiracy and a firearms count nobody expected and got 9, and lost the pension he had been so careful about, and served his time in a facility 90 minutes from the house he used to describe as a hardened residence. Charlton Hollister got 31 years. He was 62 years old. The consortium withdrew its offer 9 days after the arrest, because the one thing a buyer of Heritage Private Banking cannot survive is a headline, and Ellsworth Trust and Merchant remained what it had been for 104 years, which is a narrow limestone building on Walnut Street that does not advertise. Malcolm Ellsworth did not celebrate that. He aged 4 years and 11 months. He testified for 2 days, and shook the entire time, and did not stop once. Afterward, he wrote a letter to Charlton Hollister that he never sent and kept in a drawer, and Helena found it after he died, 11 years later, and read it once and put it back. It said, in full, "You could have just asked me why." Helena rebuilt the household from the ground up. She fired the entire protective program, all of it, including the binder, and she hired one man, and she made him sit in her office while she did it. Head of security, she said. No, ma'am. She stopped. I beg your pardon? I'd like to keep driving, Harlan said. If a man has a title, everyone knows what he does. If he's the driver, nobody thinks about him at all, and that's the entire advantage. He paused. Also, I'd have to wear a suit. Helena Ellsworth put her face in her hands and laughed until she cried, which she had not done in a year, and then she said fine, and doubled his salary anyway, and never told him it was double. Delaney went to college and came back a different person, one who called her mother twice a week, and who put a photograph on her desk of a gray Mercedes wagon that she never explained to anybody. And Elliot Ellsworth was, as everyone had feared, changed. He did not sleep in his own room for 11 weeks. In the end, despite what a man had promised in a study, he slept on a cot in the hall outside his parents' door, and Harlan built him a better one, and nobody made a thing of it. He saw a therapist twice a week for 3 years. He had a period at 12 of not being able to be in rooms with the door shut. But he also, at 14, joined the rowing team, and at 15, he taught the whole crew to tie a bowline, and at 17, he wrote a college essay he refused to let his parents read, and the admissions officer who read it later said it was about a knot. The last thing worth telling happened when Elliot was 19. He came home from his second year of school in the spring, and he found Harlan in the garage doing what Harlan did, which was maintaining something that did not need maintaining, and he sat down on the workbench in the way he had done since he was 9, and after a while he said, "Can I ask you the thing? You can ask. The night you don't talk about. Before us." Harlan wiped his hands on a rag for a while. "I did everything right," he said finally. "Every step. I was very good, and I did it perfectly, and it wasn't enough. And afterward I understood that being sent somewhere means you're always arriving after it's happened." He put the rag down. "So I stopped being someone who gets sent." Elliot thought about that for 4 seconds, which was a thing he had always done, and which had come from this man and not from his father. "That's why the different route every day," he said. "That's why the different route every day. Mom says you still do it, even now, even just going to the store." Harlan Vance opened the driver's door of a car that no one had ever photographed. "Get in," he said. "I'll show you the one that goes past the reservoir." So that's the story. Nathan again. Let me tell you what I actually took from it, because it isn't the rescue. The rescue took 9 minutes and it involved a lie and a rubber boat. What took 21 hours was the thinking, and almost all of that thinking happened before anybody was ever taken. Notice how much of what saved that boy was already in place. The knots in a traffic jam, the route that changed every day for no reason anyone could see. A driver who noticed that a service van's tires were dirtier than its driver's boots. None of that was heroism. It was maintenance. Boring, unglamorous, invisible maintenance that looked completely pointless right up until the one afternoon it was the only thing in the world that mattered. And here's the part I keep chewing on. The most dangerous person in that story was not the man with the tow truck. It was the man with 42 years of friendship and a folder. Real betrayal almost never arrives as a stranger. It arrives with coffee, and it says it's just paperwork, and it tells you it's reversible, and it is very, very sorry about what you're going through. If there's one practical thing to take away, it's this. When someone creates an emergency and then hands you a document during it, the emergency is usually there to get the signature. Slow down. A man who is genuinely on your side will let you read it tomorrow. And the other thing, teach the kids in your life something with their hands. A knot, a route home, a word that means come get me. It costs you 30 minutes in traffic. It might be the only language they've got left. If this one got you, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, what's the small, boring habit in your life that you'd want on your side on the worst day of it? I read them all. I'm Nathan. Take care of your people.